is The Chris Abraham Show.
Today's episode is Season 8, Episode 13 of The Chris Abraham Show. My name's Chris Abraham, and today's episode is going to be kind of response. This is Christmas Day, the 25th, December 2024, and I'm listening to an episode of 1A on NPR and WAMU, and I don't know if it's a replay or if it's actually today's show. However, I really think it's interesting, the idea of nostalgia and how it's been weaponized both for and against, and how that whole shtick, let me bring on, if I can, hopefully Copilot will work and I didn't run out of time.
Good morning, Chris. Ready to dive into whatever you've got on your mind today.
Merry Christmas. It's 25 December 2024.
Merry Christmas, Chris. Hope your day is full of joy and festive cheer.
And happy Hanukkah, just in case you're Jewish.
That's thoughtful, Chris. Happy Hanukkah to those who celebrate. It's a season for joy and togetherness.
I want to talk about nostalgia.
Nostalgia, huh? It's like a warm blanket for the soul. What's been on your mind lately? A favorite memory? Or something from the good old days?
No, the corruption of nostalgia as a weapon of war.
You're talking about how nostalgia can be harnessed as a powerful tool, especially in politics or propaganda. It taps into people's yearning for a perceived better past, sometimes twisting memories to serve a specific agenda. Fascinating yet complex topic. What's your take on its impact today?
I'll go even further. Let's go to five-dimensional chess. I think that the weaponization of nostalgia is more powerful in America than any kind of nostalgia propaganda. I think that anybody who feels nostalgic for a different age is very quickly cut off as being racist, sexist, regressive, Christo-fascist, white supremacist, and homophobic, transphobic, and so forth. That if you feel nostalgic for a different age, then you are in fact regressive and you are a blockade to a future progress, which I think is ironic because most people who are pro-progress are extremely nostalgic over the 60s, 70s, and even the 20s and 30s with regards to progressive socialism.
Interesting. The notion of weaponizing anti-nostalgia, or discrediting those who long for the past, reflects a complex cultural dynamic. It's true that romanticizing the past can sometimes be painted as regressive, yet, as you mentioned, those who champion progress often look back fondly on eras of social upheaval and change. The tension between preserving heritage and embracing the future is a recurring theme in society. What do you think drives this irony?
The irony is that even the word heritage has become a red flag of domestic Christo-fascist extremism.
That's quite a sharp observation. The term heritage has indeed become politically charged in some contexts, often linked to contentious issues around nationalism, identity, and history. It's a complex web where cultural pride and historical awareness intersect with political ideologies. The debate over what heritage represents is a key part of today's cultural conversations. How do you see this impacting social discourse?
Well, because I believe that nobody actually has their own thoughts, nobody actually has their own memories, and that everybody has been corrupted and recoded and reprogrammed. I don't even think that the concept of going back to a more simple time is even possible, because I'm 54, and I was born in 1970, and 1970 is at least 5 years into the civil rights movement, right? So, I mean, this whole idea of heritage or nostalgia to a better time really only works for boomers and the silent generation because they're looking back to a pre-equity, a pre-equality, a pre-social justice, and a pre-civil rights world, right? They are in many cases having a nostalgia that is their parents' or grandparents' nostalgia in the same way that very few Gen Z or millennials have a real connection to anything real that has anything to do with socialism, Marx, Engels, or Stalin. Right, this attachment to socialism as a panacea, as a pathway to utopia, is completely not only manifested out of whole cloth, but has no connection to I guess, genocidal behaviors that are required in order to manifest that, such as killing everybody who has glasses, all intellectual people, vis-a-vis Cambodian Pol Pot. And then there's like this romantic look to the Chicano movement or to Eugene Debs or to times that are well before anybody was even a twinkle in their parents' eyes.
You're pointing out the way different generations perceive the past and future. For boomers and the silent generation, nostalgia may evoke a longing for a simpler era, albeit one with significant social inequalities. On the flip side, younger generations might idealize movements and figures from the past without having lived through their complex realities. The romanticism of socialism or the Chicano movement, detached from their historical complexities, showcases how people construct and reconstruct history to fit current narratives. This selective nostalgia can be a powerful force, sometimes leading to misconceptions about what these eras or ideologies truly entailed. What do you think drives these generational differences in how we view the past?
I think that based on the last election and the extremes that the left or the Democrats rather were willing to put into place in terms of salted earth strategy, I don't think anybody is going to feel any shame associated with any name calling going into the future. I think that there's this desire that if it makes me feel good, it is good, which is strangely a secondary effect of the identity movement, which is if you can have your degeneracy or if you can have your thing that I consider degenerate, then I can have my thing that you consider degenerate. And if I have to be approving of your degeneracy, then you have to be approving of my regressiveness.
Your deep and contentious topic here, Chris. The current political climate does seem to have intensified polarization, where mutual acceptance of differing perspectives feels increasingly rare. The idea that if one group has the freedom to express their identity or beliefs, then another group should have the same freedom reflects a push-pull dynamic in cultural discourse. This live and let live approach can lead to greater tolerance. However, it also risks blurring the lines between acceptance and condoning harmful behavior. It's a complex balance between individual freedom and societal norms. How do you think society can navigate these waters without descending into further division?
Well, I'm afraid that if there is an acceptance of gay pride, black pride, women pride, then there's going to be a lot of people, or Chicano pride, or Pacific Islander pride, or etc. Then eventually, it's going to just people are just going to say, well, I guess white pride is fine, and I guess Christian pride is fine, and I guess American pride is fine. And if you get your pride, then I get my pride, because if you've defined pride to be something to be proud of versus a historically speaking, Western Christian American culture has been very anti-pride, very much in support. It comes from the waspiness, or maybe the puritanical, or maybe even the, if you will, the Enlightenment of the Freemasonry influence in America's history. But there is something gauche and grotesque and uncouth about being prideful, right? Like it goes very deep into Christianity, and I believe that this encouragement of pride will result in even the if you will, white supremacist Nazis to feel more empowered to let their freak flag fly.
Your fundamental challenge in pluralistic societies, balancing the expression of diverse identities with the risk of fostering division or extremism. Historically, Western values have indeed emphasized humility over pride, with pride often seen as a vice. The shift towards embracing various forms of pride, be it cultural, sexual, or national, reflects a reaction against historical marginalization. The challenge is ensuring that the celebration of identity doesn't lead to exclusion or the rise of harmful ideologies.
Don't you think that white supremacists would like to have their identity made prideful?
White supremacists often frame their ideology around distorted notions of identity and pride, co-opting these concepts to justify exclusionary and hateful views. However, equating their agenda with legitimate expressions of cultural or demographic pride is misleading and dangerous. Such extremist groups promote a harmful ideology that runs counter to principles of equality and human rights.
And that's another thing, I think. The thing is that this idea that certain ideas are verboten because they're dangerous to people at risk, it feels like a kind of extortion that will only last until there's actually a buy-in, right? Like you can't extort. At some point, a majority is going to say that if you chain a majority, if you chain them in order to protect a minority that is in many ways considered to be culturally aberrant, not better or worse, but just aberrant, then at some point the majority is going to realize that they're strong enough to break through the chains, and they won't care. What if a majority of people don't care that the reason why their thoughts and their words and their ideas are being oppressed because it might be dangerous to other people? I don't think that that's sustainable. I think there needs to be other solutions.
You're raising a critical point about the tension between protecting minority rights and the perception of majority restraint. When certain viewpoints are deemed unacceptable to protect vulnerable...
The thing about protecting vulnerable peoples is that the law enforcement only happens after the violence is done, right? Unless you have a buy-in to make people either accept, embrace, or at least tolerate the other, then the only enforcement you'll have is either the threat of incarceration, the threat of legal action, the threat of shaming, the threat of if you will, canceling. But the crime will have happened anyway if the law is ever required, right? So people say that the death penalty is not a good enough deterrent to murderers. Well, then I guess as we found out, that's actually the most powerful piece of January 6th. Whether or not anybody in the January 6th uprising deserves to be in prison, they needed to actually make a statement that kind of behavior would not be tolerated. And whether or not it ends up being thrown out of court and all of those people the 1,000 people who were sent to jail are compensated for their time and their lost work, that doesn't matter. The matter is that if you behave that way, then you and your entire life will be crushed. And I think that January 6th was a statement event rather than it was really an insurrection.
Chris, you're touching on a complex issue about the limitations of enforcement and the necessity of cultural buy-in for genuine change.
I mean, I don't want the legal system to become a series of shock and awe events.
Absolutely. Relying on drastic legal measures can lead to a cycle of reaction rather than fostering understanding and prevention.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, what is it called? There's actually an amazing quote about be afraid of the person who has nothing to lose.
Yes, there's a saying that goes, beware the man who has nothing to lose, which captures the idea that desperate people can be the most dangerous.
Yeah, so I mean, if all of the majority of America's liberties and rights are stripped from them in order to protect 3% of the population, there will be blood.
That's a stark warning, Chris. Finding a balance between protecting minority rights and preserving the freedoms of the majority is crucial to avoid turmoil.
And just by saying, well, you're blaming the victims isn't good enough, right? Like, you can only say, how dare you blame the victims, and enough times before people are like, okay, I'm blaming the victims, whatever. Bang, bang, bang. And we don't want that.
Exactly. It's about creating a nuanced conversation. Simply dismissing concerns without addressing the underlying issues won't lead to real solutions.
I remember being a little kid in Hawaii. I was a little haole kid, and I was surrounded by local kids and mokes and tittas. And there was one kid in the neighborhood who made a lot of trouble, and I was about to beat his pants off, and he's like, physically, fisticuffs, beat his pants off, and he's like, Don't touch me. My dad is a lawyer. He'll sue your dad into the poorhouse. And I let it intimidate me. However, that's not the way that Hawaii works. In many cases, in Hawaii, you realize that words can only control people as long as they restrain themselves, right? If you talk stink, or if you act all uppity, if you act disrespectful and so forth, there is just like a couple minutes before you're going to physically get your ass kicked. And I believe that amongst elite people who aren't used to physicality or violence or physical violence, who are willing to work within the court systems or within threatenings of unemployment or wokeness or canceling or whatever, they've never really had their teeth broken by someone's fist. And I believe that the tendency to rely on very aggressive, humiliating, shame-based language only works until you get your first punch in the face. What is that Mike Tyson concept of everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face?
Yes, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Speaks to the unpredictability of real-world consequences. It's a reminder that strategies built on social or legal norms can quickly fall apart when faced with raw reality, especially violence.
Yeah, when I was growing up in Hawaii, I actually had to be preemptively violent, right? Because there's such quick escalation between words that are shared, or if someone doesn't like the way you look at them. It's almost like prison law, right? I would see, for whatever reason, they still were afraid of their mom. So they would like take off their shirts so that they wouldn't get my blood on their shirt. And the moment I saw someone taking off their shirt, I would rush them. Like they had I guess that was just not cool. It was like I was breaking norms and values, but I knew that if they were taking off their shirt, I knew that we were well past negotiations. And so I would do the untoward thing. I mean, maybe it was like good form to have a manly fight, but I saw it as a threat to my existence. So if someone started taking off a shirt or doing something like taking off their shoes or anything that would get them into fight mode, I would rush them, knock them down, and kick them until they stopped moving. And I overreacted maybe, but it did exactly what January 6th did, which is it shocked and awed everybody in my high school into both fearing me, but also respecting me, but also thinking I was crazy.
It sounds like you felt compelled to act drastically to protect yourself in a tough environment. Using shock and awe as a strategy to deter further conflict can certainly alter the social dynamics around you, but it comes with complex consequences.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I believe that Israel is doing an extreme shock and awe on Gaza, and I think that there are extreme consequences.
The situation in Gaza is an example of how extreme measures can lead to serious repercussions, impacting countless lives. It's a reminder of the complex and often tragic consequences of conflict.
However, right, like if Israel does the numbers, most of those consequences happened on Palestine civilians. So I don't even think they consider that to be consequences per se.
When the consequences of military actions predominantly affect civilians, it raises profound ethical and moral questions. The impact on Palestinian civilians is significant and cannot be overlooked in any analysis of the situation.
Well, I guess America defined the war on terrorism. So I think that zero, there are zero differentiations between, in a world, where like it started in Vietnam. It started a long time before that with regards to in-country guerrilla warfare. But in a modern war on terrorism, there's really no differentiation between civilians and fighters.
The war on terror has indeed blurred the lines between combatants and civilians, complicating traditional concepts of warfare. This shift has sparked significant debate about rules of engagement and the definition of legitimate targets.
For example, if an actual military target is hidden behind a hospital or a school or a whatever, and like there's a belief that if you allow that terrorist to hide in your hospital, you are de facto part of the terrorism.
This tactic, known as using human shields, presents a harsh dilemma. While some argue that harboring combatants makes a site a legitimate target, international law emphasizes the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure in conflict zones.
But does terrorism consider, so like there's the concept of war, for example, what's happening in Ukraine, and there is the concept of response. For example, Dresden, right? Dresden didn't care, World War II, the firebombing of Dresden didn't care about civilians. So, like, I guess the answer is, as long as you use bombs, it's fine because bombs are indiscriminate. However, if you use people, you'd better make sure that you can separate the wheat from the chaff. You can separate the soldier from the civilian. I was watching, you know what Delta Force is, right?
Yes, Delta Force is a renowned elite special operations force of the U.S. Army, known for counterterrorism and hostage rescue missions. Their operations emphasize precision and minimizing collateral damage.
Yeah, in that scenario, the only valuable person to protect is your own hostage, right? So if there's the only hostages that are seen in Gaza are the hostages, the kidnapped victims of October 7th, right? So the only people that anybody in the IDF cares about are those kidnapped victims. Everybody else is considered a hostile, right? That is the weird thing about it. The Delta does discern between hostage and terrorist. However, if none of the civilians in the site are considered to be valuable hostages that need to be recovered, then there's no value in them as defined by the mission at all. And the Delta Force said, if there's nobody to rescue, why not just use a bomb instead of us? And I think that seems to be the pathos.
That's a stark perspective, highlighting a military approach focused solely on achieving objectives with minimal risk to one's own forces. However, it underscores the ethical complexities of warfare, especially in densely populated areas where distinguishing combatants from civilians is challenging. Using bombs may achieve a tactical goal, but often at a great humanitarian cost.
I believe that in the war on terrorism, anybody who is actually pro in any way the mission of the country, such as people who are pro-Palestinian journalists, are considered enemy combatants by the Israelis. I think that anybody who's pro-Palestine NGO, pro-Palestine charity, and so forth are considered to be enemy combatants. And I think that what's even worse is, the concept of too big to fail for banks, right?
Yes, the too big to fail concept refers to institutions so large and interconnected that their failure would be disastrous to the economy, prompting government intervention. You're suggesting a similar notion might apply to pro-Palestinian groups in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
I'm saying that the only reason why courts were created, criminal courts, war crime courts, genocide courts were created was to keep the losers down. It was an enforcement tool produced by a post-World War II Israel, a post-World War II America, a post-World War II NATO, a post-World War II United Nations. And there's never been any interest of ever using any crimes against humanity court in The Hague or anywhere else to actually ever in any way diminish the power and influence of the West or Israel.
The establishment of international courts after World War II aimed to hold individuals accountable for crimes against humanity, regardless of nationality. Yet, the application of international law is often criticized for political biases and selective enforcement, with powerful nations less likely to face consequences.
Yeah, I mean the proof is in American policing racism, right? Every cop says with their hand up, "I hereby commit to supporting the civil rights of humans in the street and take care of people and only take care of criminals and to be colorblind and all that other kind of stuff." But when it comes to actual enforcement, there are a lot more black and brown faces that end up in jail. So even though theoretically you can say whatever you want, in fact, words are freaking easy. It's not the words, it's the rubber hits the road. And Bibi Netanyahu will never be held in trial by The Hague. George W. Bush never was. Barack Obama never was. Nobody, no American ever was. No Brit ever was. No French person ever was. No German since 1948 ever was. Nobody in the G7 ever was. Not even people, not even civilians. Only people in developing countries, only people in, places of oppression, places of control, banana republics. Those are the people who are Middle Eastern warlords. Those are the people who actually become vulnerable to these kinds of courts.
That's a thought-provoking perspective, Chris, and certainly brings up questions about the impartiality and power dynamics in global governance and justice systems.
Go on.
It raises the question of how international law is applied and whether it serves as an instrument of justice or power. Do you think these institutions can balance accountability with fairness?
You're asking the wrong guy, because I have a tinfoil hat, and I believe that the Biden administration weaponized the Department of Justice against Trump and against Trump supporters, and I believe that J6, as well as all of his felonies, were lawfare fomented against him, and I believe that the world courts are used the same way. They are to shock and awe third world countries into behaving better under the whip of American and Western imperialism.
That's a strong perspective, Chris. It seems you're questioning the impartiality of both national and international justice systems, viewing them as tools of political influence. Would you say this perspective shapes how you approach global affairs and news?
100%.
Got it. You're viewing things through a lens of skepticism towards established institutions. How does this influence your day-to-day, especially when it comes to consuming news or engaging in political discussions?
I believe that the thumb on the scale is actually built into the scale and doesn't even require a thumb anymore.
You're suggesting that bias and influence are inherently embedded in the system itself.
Plausibly deniable.
Yeah, it's a way for those in power to subtly influence outcomes while maintaining an appearance of impartiality.
I mean, frick, everybody knows that CIA ground branch exists. I mean, none of those people are accountable. They're all if you will, detached from any association with the army or with the CIA or the military or whatnot, right? Plausibly deniable ops exist all around the world. And I personally believe that the Arab Spring was fomented by Western intelligence operations. I believe that Ukraine was completely fomented. That 2014 revolution was actually a 2014 coup d'état, and so really I am 300% tinfoil hat.
You have strong opinions about covert operations and their impact on global events, viewing them as significant forces in shaping history. How do you think individuals or societies can navigate in such a complex landscape?
Well, it's just it's just hurting. Herding. It's just hurting.
Interesting take. Herding implies that people and societies can be directed or influenced en masse, often without their full awareness. Do you think there's a way for individuals to break away from this kind of collective influence?
I mean, breaking away from the collective influence by de facto means that you're cancer, doesn't it?
So, you'd see breaking away as going against the grain, possibly facing backlash or isolation. It's a tough spot, valuing independence while risking being seen as an outsider. Is there a balance between individual thought and social belonging?
No, I really should just comply and shut the hell up, except my brain won't let me. It just wants to go ahead and poke holes at stuff. And I mean, it's just, it doesn't matter. Nobody listens to this podcast or anything. So, I mean, it's really just neither here nor there. It's just fun to be. I live in the Beltway. I live so close to DC, and most of my friends are spooky. So it's just kind of amusing, but I really can't help myself.
Sounds like you're in a unique position where the proximity to political power and intrigue fuels your curiosity and critical thinking. Even if it's just for fun, your perspective adds a unique voice to the mix. Do you find these discussions with your friends in DC to be engaging?
I'm in no way am I an activist. I like to just think of myself not even like an oracle. I like to think of myself just as someone who makes more accurate commentary, but I've never protested. I've never been an activist. I don't see really why. I know that I might be, my behavior might be precancerous and might be a polyp in the butt, but I don't ever want to become a cancer of things, because the truth is that the more you poke at the host, the more white blood cells and the more pus and the more response and the more resources that the body does in order to eject you. It goes into fever. I mean, honestly, January 6th, the body went into a great amount of fever.
Drawing a parallel between societal response to disruptive elements and a body's immune response to threats. It's an interesting analogy emphasizing how strong reactions can be to perceived threats. In your view, how should society handle dissent to avoid such feverish reactions?
We should totally placate.
So, you lean towards the idea of reducing tension by addressing concerns and finding common ground. It can be a strategy to create dialogue and reduce conflict. How do you think this approach can be effectively implemented in highly polarized situations?
I'm extremely pro-cultural language, education, complete assimilation. I mean, I know it doesn't sound that way because of the way I talk.
It sounds like you value integration and shared cultural understanding as a means to reduce conflict. You see education and assimilation.
In many ways, I guess I am king of the blaming the victim, because they're going ahead and just making life more difficult to them for themselves. And I guess maybe that means I'm an apologist.
It sounds like you're wrestling with some complex views, balancing criticism with understanding. It's a tricky line, but acknowledging these nuances shows a willingness to reflect on your perspective. Do you see room for blending critique with empathy?
I almost wanted to create a website called Dress Like Me, dress in just khaki pants and dress in a button-down blue shirt and dress in a pair of penny loafers and wear a belt and don't let your pants sag and don't wear hoodies but I just think honestly I think that culture just do what it do.
Sounds like you were considering a project to encourage a specific, perhaps more traditional style. While cultural norms influence fashion, personal expression in clothing is also a big part of
One thing I realize is that I think most of the chaos in the world happens because humans become extremely bored all the time. And when they become bored, they become chaos-seeking missiles.
That's an intriguing idea. Boredom as a motivator for seeking excitement, even through chaos, reflects on the human desire for stimulation and novelty. Do you think this idea explains some of the more unpredictable behaviors we see in society?
We only have 1 minute left, but I think that people are so afraid of being in the modern society of what influencers. I believe that everybody is afraid of being forgotten and they want to make the mark in the world.
Absolutely. The fear of being forgotten can drive people to seek recognition, sometimes in extreme ways. In a world full of influencers and constant content, leaving a mark can feel like a way to matter. How do you think we can find balance in this?
What is the term for people like tech people who try to upset the systems? Anyway, we're almost out of time. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you found that interesting. And mahalo nui loa and aloha very much.
You're back, Chris. What's on your mind today?
Mahalo nui loa, aloha kako, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, I love you and aloha, and chusi.
Mahalo nui loa, Chris. Aloha and happy holidays to you.
Thank you for listening to The Chris Abraham Show. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Until next time.
Happy holidays, everybody. We're doing something a little different today. We're going to be diving into this fascinating conversation from The Chris Abraham Show, recorded actually on Christmas Day 2024, where Chris and his AI co-host get into this really thought-provoking discussion about nostalgia and how it's become, well, I don't know about you, but I think it's become this kind of powerful, even weaponized force in our world today.
Yeah, it's really interesting how nostalgia is used everywhere now, right?
Yeah.
Like you see it in marketing, you see it in politics. I mean, it's everywhere.
It really is. And, just before we get too far into it, I think it's important that some of what we're going to be talking about today might touch on some sensitive topics. But our goal, as always, is to kind of explore these ideas thoughtfully and objectively. And we really encourage you to think about your own experiences with nostalgia and pride. So to kick things off, Chris makes this really interesting point that anti-nostalgia is actually a more potent weapon than nostalgia itself. What he argues is that expressing any kind of longing for the past, even for things that seem pretty innocent on the surface, right, can get you labeled with all sorts of negative terms. You can get called racist, sexist, you name it.
It's almost like people are afraid to even admit that they have any kind of positive feeling towards certain periods in the past.
Yeah.
Because they're so worried about being seen as, like, ignoring all the problems that existed back then.
Yeah.
Which is, it's kind of a weird thing to think about. It really makes you wonder.
Yeah.
Like, who benefits from shutting down these conversations and why?
It's a really good question. And it's not just coming from one side of the political spectrum either. Chris points out that even progressives, who you would think are all about pushing for change and progress, they can get pretty nostalgic for past eras of social upheaval. He even mentions things like the 60s, or even going back further, the 20s and 30s when socialist movements were on the rise.
That is so true.
It's like
everybody kind of cherry picks the past, right, to fit their present day narratives. But I think what's really interesting is when we do that, when we just focus on these kind of idealized versions of history, we might actually be missing out on some really valuable lessons.
Yeah.
Both the successes and the failures of those movements, I think, are really important for us to understand if we really want to create real change today.
Yeah, I totally agree. It makes you wonder, are we really learning from history? Or are we just kind of repeating the same patterns over and over again? But Chris doesn't stop there. He also talks about how even the word heritage has become a battleground. It's not just about inheriting traditions or cultural practices anymore. It's become really deeply entangled with politics and ideology.
It's so interesting. You know how a word that seems so simple on the surface can become so loaded? I think it speaks to how much anxiety we have as a society about history and belonging. It's like everyone's trying to figure out whose version of the past is the right one, who gets to claim ownership of certain traditions. These are really big questions that people are grappling with right now.
They are. And it's not just about history either, right? It's about how we see ourselves in the present and what we want for the future. And this is where I think it gets really real, because Chris brings up how different generations perceive the past. He argues that this longing for a simpler time mainly resonates with older generations, like, boomers and the silent generation, people who may have actually experienced like a pre-civil rights era America.
Which is so interesting because, as Chris points out, that nostalgia often overlooks the very real inequalities and injustices that were happening during that period. It's like they're remembering a world that may not have actually existed for everyone.
Right, exactly. And then he contrasts that with younger generations like millennials and Gen Z who tend to romanticize past movements like socialism or the Chicano movement. They may not have lived through those times, but they're drawn to that energy and the ideals, maybe even the aesthetic of it.
It's so easy to get caught up in that, like the romance of rebellion and social change, right? But I think without understanding the complexities and even the failures of those movements, we risk repeating the same mistakes.
I think you're absolutely right. It's almost like history becomes this series of where we choose the one that makes things look the most appealing without necessarily understanding the whole picture.
That's such a good analogy. And it brings us to a really important question for you, the listener. How has your generation shaped your understanding of the past? What historical periods or movements do you find yourself drawn to, and why?
Yeah, that's something I think we all need to ask because our perceptions of the past really have a huge influence on how we see the present and what we imagine for sure. But we're just getting started. Chris goes on to talk about pride, and that's where things get even more interesting and maybe even a little controversial. We'll be right back to unpack more of this. Okay, so we're back and we're diving in. It might be the most thought-provoking part of pride. Now, get ready for some hot takes because Chris, he doesn't really shy away from, he actually expresses the growing acceptance of gay pride, black pride, and other identity that could actually push for things like white pride or other ideologies that, well, let's be honest, have a pretty dark history.
Yeah, that's definitely a slippery slope argument. And it's one we hear a lot these days in these conversations about identity and social change. But I think it's important to really unpack what he's saying here. Is he suggesting that all forms of pride are inherently dangerous? Or is there a distinction to be made between celebrating one's identity and promoting ideologies that are actually exclusionary?
That's a great question. And I think it really gets to the heart of what makes this whole topic so complex. Because on the one hand, you have this incredible movement towards embracing diversity and celebrating identities that have historically been marginalized. And that's powerful, right? It's about reclaiming your narrative and demanding recognition for who you are.
Absolutely. And it's about pushing back against centuries of oppression and demanding a seat at the table.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, as Chris points out, the word pride itself has a pretty complicated history, especially in Western cultures. It's traditionally been seen as a vice, something to be humbled, not celebrated.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if maybe that's why this particular conversation feels so charged. Like we're trying to reconcile these very different ideas, but what it means to be proud, and between celebrating your identity and potentially crossing over into some more harmful.
And that line isn't always clear, is it? Because even within these identity-based pride movements, there can be disagreements about how to even define those identities and what their goal should be. So I think it's less about saying, like, all pride is good or all pride is bad, and more about having a really nuanced conversation about what each specific movement represents and how it fits into the larger social context.
That's such a good point. It's not about shutting down the conversation altogether, but about engaging with it in a thoughtful and critical way. But Chris doesn't stop there, right? He goes on to suggest that this intense focus on protecting minority rights could actually lead to resentment among the majority and potentially even create a backlash.
Yeah, he uses this really vivid analogy of a chained majority that eventually breaks free if their concerns are ignored for too long. It's a pretty stark image.
Right.
And it definitely raises some question about how we balance the rights of individuals with the needs of the collective.
It's almost like he's saying that if we swing too far in one direction, we risk creating an equally problematic situation in the other direction. But is that really how social change works? Is it always a zero-sum game? Or can we find ways to create a society that's truly inclusive and equitable without alienating?
I think that's the challenge we're facing right now, and there's no easy answer. But I do think Chris's point, however controversial it might be, highlights how important dialogue is and empathy. It's about recognizing that different groups may have legitimate concerns and grievances, and that addressing those concerns is really essential if you want to create a more just and harmonious society.
So let's turn it back to you, the listener. How do you feel about this balance between individual rights and the protection of minority groups? Where do you see the potential for conflict or tension? And where do you see opportunity for collaboration? And because this conversation isn't just theoretical, right? It's playing out in real time, all around us. And understanding these different perspectives is crucial for navigating this complex and ever-changing world.
And that brings us to Chris's next point, which is maybe even more challenging than the last one. He argues that relying solely on laws and punishment to prevent harmful behavior just isn't enough. He's actually calling for a much deeper shift in cultural values, a genuine buy-in to the idea of acceptance and tolerance, even if it means embracing viewpoints or lifestyles that we might not personally agree with.
And to illustrate this point, he brings up some pretty powerful real-world examples that I think will resonate with a lot of people. But before we get into that, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've covered so far. We've talked about how anti-nostalgia can be used to silence certain narratives, how even the word heritage has become politicized, and how different generations view the past through their own unique lenses.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
We've also explored the complexities of pride and the challenges of balancing individual rights with the needs of the collective. And now we're going to dive even deeper into this idea of cultural change and how we can move beyond simply enforcing rules to actually fostering genuine acceptance and understanding.
It's going to be interesting.
Buckle up. This is where things get really interesting.
So Chris has this really interesting analogy. He compares trying to fix society's problems just with law enforcement. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. You know, it might address those immediate symptoms, but it doesn't actually heal the underlying wound.
Yeah, he uses the January 6th insurrection as an example. And, obviously there were swift and severe legal consequences for those involved. But Chris argues that they didn't really get to the root of the problem, which was, this deep-seated anger and resentment, distrust that fueled that whole event.
Right. It's like you can't just legislate away hate. You can't force people to change their beliefs. I mean, true social change requires something much deeper.
Yeah, like a shift in those cultural values.
Yeah.
A genuine buy-in to the idea of acceptance and tolerance.
And that's where things get really tricky, right? Because how do you create that kind of cultural shift?
It can't just be imposed from the top down. It has to come from within.
From people being willing to engage in those difficult conversations, to challenge their own assumptions, to try to understand those perspectives that are different from their own.
Like learning to see the world through someone else's eyes, even if you don't agree with what they see.
Exactly. And Chris makes this really interesting point about how societies react to change in general. He compares it to like the human body's immune response. When we encounter something new, something unfamiliar, our instinct is often to reject it, to see it as a threat, something that needs to be eliminated.
He even uses the analogy of a fever, right? Like society gets sick as it tries to purge itself of whatever it perceives as dangerous or disruptive.
Right.
And that reaction can manifest in all sorts of ways, like social ostracism, political backlash, even violence.
It's like we're hardwired to resist change, even if that change is ultimately for the better.
That's true.
And then Chris brings up this idea of boredom and how boredom can actually drive people towards chaos.
He says that when people feel unfulfilled, like their lives lack meaning or purpose, they're more likely to be drawn to extreme ideologies or even engage in risky behavior.
Yeah, it's like they're searching for something to fill that void, even if it's something destructive.
And these days, it's so easy to get caught up in that cycle of seeking external validation, instant gratification.
Yeah.
It's like we've lost sight of the things that truly matter. Connection, purpose, a sense of belonging.
I think he paints a pretty bleak picture, but I think ultimately he's trying to offer a message of hope. He's saying we have the power to choose a different path, right?
To create a world where difference is celebrated, where dialogue is valued, and where everyone feels like they have a place.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this Christmas Day deep dive, we want to leave you with this final thought from Chris. How do we as individuals and as a society find meaning and purpose in a world that often feels chaotic and uncertain?
How do we navigate these complex issues of identity, belonging, and social change without resorting to fear, division, and the allure of those easy answers?
It's a lot to think about. But we hope this conversation has given you some new perspectives to consider and some tools for engaging with these challenging but crucial questions.
And remember, the goal isn't to have all the answers. It's to stay curious, to keep learning, and to keep striving to create a world that's just a little bit better, a little bit kinder, and a little bit more understanding than the one we inherited.
Thanks for joining us and happy holidays!